The entrance to the Hyperverse Expo shimmered in gradients of cyan and gold, a sleek glass archway, flanked by chrome robots and pulsing LED displays. Young, confident tech enthusiasts, dressed in augmented glasses and smart fabric hoodies, filtered in their QR codes, scanning seamlessly biometric nods accepted without a second thought. It was a world of tomorrow where the future was now. But at the gate stood an old man, Robert Bobby Slater, 81, his faded army green jacket, bearing a crookedly sewn patch at the shoulder. His trousers, neatly pressed, were from another era, simple, unassuming, but sturdy. In his hand, he held a printed sheet, an email invitation folded carefully in thirds. The paper trembled slightly in his weathered fingers, a subtle sign of age, but his voice was steady. "Excuse me," Bobby said to the young woman at the reception podium, his voice calm but firm. "I believe I'm registered. I got this from your website. It says veterans are invited to test the simulations today." The woman barely glanced at the paper. "Sir, we need a QR code. Printed emails aren't valid," she said, her tone dismissive as she motioned toward the help desk with a plastic smile. "If you're lost, they can assist you." "I'm not lost," Bobby replied. "I'm here to try the war sim." It said veteran feedback was welcome. A nearby attendee snorted loud enough for Bobby to hear. Boomers trying to plug into the grid. Hilarious. Bobby didn't flinch. He'd heard worse in worse places. His eyes lingered on the scanner in front of him, its red light flashing again, denied. "Excuse me," Bobby said again, this time a touch firmer. "I'm trying to help, just trying to see if my experience might be useful." Behind him, a group of interns brushed past, muttering something about VR still needing wires. The receptionist's smile tightened, her patience clearly thinning. "Security, please." She called out, her voice sharper now, as a guard in a matte black uniform approached. He was young, tall, and seemed uninterested in the situation unfolding before him. "Do you have ID, sir?" the guard asked, his tone devoid of any warmth. Bobby reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a card from the Ministry of Defense, an old challenge coin with a symbol almost rubbed smooth, and a faded photo of three men in desert fatigues, arms around each other, smiling through dust and fatigue. The guard barely glanced at it, his eyes flitting briefly before he waved Bobby toward the side. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside," the guard said, turning away before Bobby could respond. Bobby's voice was soft but steady as he spoke to the guards retreating back. "I came here because I thought someone might care what it actually felt like." He murmured, his words tinged with quiet disappointment. "Turns out you'd rather pretend it than hear it." The scanner blinked red again as the guard led him toward the edge of the entrance lane. Bobby glanced up at the words etched above the glass arch. "Welcome to tomorrow." He almost smiled. "Seems I'm not invited," he said under his breath. A technician glanced up from her terminal as Bobby was reluctantly waved through the side gate, flanked by a supervisor who muttered something about PR exceptions. No one smiled. No one made eye contact. They just ushered him through. Booth 9A gleamed ahead like a shiny capsule from a sci-fi movie. Matte silver with augmented layers rotating in midair, the bold text shimmering warfront tactical heroism in the age of AI. Real simulations, real morality, real choices. "Name," the technician asked without even looking up. "Robert Slater," Bobby answered quietly. "Have you used haptics before?" the technician asked. She handed him a controller shaped like a rifle grip. "Something like them," Bobby muttered, his hands instinctively tightening around the grip. It was foreign yet somehow familiar. "Grip it firm. It'll vibrate when hit. Full sim starts in 30, she said, her tone flat. "Just follow the prompts, don't interfere with the story branch." Bobby nodded without speaking, stepping into the booth. The door hissed shut behind him, and the world around him shifted. Inside, the air was thick with dust. He stood in a flattened Middle Eastern village, a place that seemed both too generic and yet uncannily real. Synthetic cries echoed through the still air, and a drone buzzed overhead, its rotors a sharp reminder of the world outside. On his heads-up display, words flashed across the screen. "Lead your squad to secure Point Alpha." A squad of digital soldiers stood around him, their eyes glazed over. They waited, but they didn't speak. The mission was clear, pre-programmed, sterile. "Commander orders," one of the soldiers asked in a voice so polished it felt almost pre-recorded. Bobby scanned the terrain. The AI's programming was wrong. The cover positions were exposed, the angles off. He could see the enemy flanking positions, but the simulation couldn't. "Don't push forward," Bobby said, his voice calm but decisive. "We pull back, use the western incline." The AI hesitated. "That path deviates from mission parameters." "Negative result," likely, the AI responded. Bobby snorted. "That's your version of war. Negative results are certain. The trick is living through them." He moved anyway. The gunfire erupted, perfectly choreographed, too clean. Bobby dropped low, shouting commands to his imaginary squad. "Split left, watch the minaret. Sniper patterns, too clean. It's bait." The haptics trembled faintly as a shot registered in the simulation, and Bobby flinched, not from the vibration, but from the sound. It was wrong. Gunfire wasn't crisp. It was thunder in your teeth, a shudder through your bones. Bobby's movements didn't follow the program's path. He flanked, took cover, timed his shots. He didn't care for the tutorial. He was working on instinct. He took down 2 enemies with 3 shots, not by the game's flowchart, but by pure experience. The simulation didn't like that. A red alert blinked on his screen. Behavioral divergence detected. Adjusting AI engagement. He ignored it. The mission ended with failure, morale loss, tactical confusion. The screen flashed the words, but Bobby stood still, looking out at the virtual battlefield. "That wasn't confusion," he whispered to himself. "That was mercy." As the door hissed open behind him, Bobby stepped out into the stark, sterile hallway of the expo. His hands still tingled, but it wasn't from the haptics. It was from the memory of real war, the kind that the simulation could never truly capture. He had tried to show them something real, but all they saw was failure. Bobby's hands still tingled from the simulation as he stepped out of the booth. The sterile hallway felt colder now, the blaring lights above a harsh contrast to the fading echoes of his instincts. The air smelled of metal and plastic, synthetic, like everything else in this world of shiny promises and virtual realities. Bobby's eyes, still adjusting to the sudden return to this sanitized world, narrowed as he looked around. The walls were lined with glass panels, digital screens, flickering with ads and announcements of upcoming shows, all hyper-modern and cold. He didn't belong here. His thoughts drifted back to the virtual battlefield, to the war simulation that had just played out. It was supposed to be an immersive experience, something cutting edge, a new form of training for modern soldiers. But Bobby had seen enough real conflict to know that the clean, polished simulations could never truly replicate the raw, chaotic nature of war. He glanced down at the controller still in his hand, the cold plastic now seeming even more alien. It was a far cry from the rifle he'd once held, a far cry from the weight of a weapon that had been a part of him in ways this piece of tech could never understand. He had followed the instructions, but somewhere deep inside he had known it wouldn't be enough. The AI, the algorithms, the code. It was also sterile. It didn't account for the human element, the chaos, the choices made in the heat of battle. As he walked down the hallway, he saw a group of developers lingering near a hydration station. The laughter of the young interns cut through the silence. Bobby didn't look at them. He already knew what they'd say. They would mock him again like the others had. He'd grown used to it over the years, the sneers, the condescension. This was just another day in the future, one where veterans like him no longer had a place. "Hey, soldier boy," one of the developers called out. Bobby turned slowly to face them. They stood in a group, a trio of young, smug faces with headphones around their necks and drinks in hand. Damien, the loudest, stepped forward with a grin on his face. "You just got out of booth 9, right?" Bobby didn't respond, his gaze steady. He knew what was coming next. "You totally tanked the mission," Damien said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I mean, 0 kills, no objectives. What was your plan? Grandpa hugged the enemy to death." He laughed, the others joining in their voices, echoing down the hallway. Bobby didn't flinch. He didn't react. He'd been in worse situations. He'd seen worse things than the juvenile mockery of these children. One of them, Lexi, the youngest of the trio, piped up, her voice laced with derision. "Maybe he thought it was real war, you know. That analog stuff," she said, looking at Bobby with exaggerated pity. "He's probably stuck in the past." Bobby's eyes flicked to the side, his expression neutral. He didn't need to say anything. They thought he was just some old man, some relic of a time that no longer mattered. They didn't understand. But the sting wasn't new. He'd carried worse wounds before. He held his ground, but his fingers tightened slightly around the coin tucked into his jacket pocket. It was a simple thing worn smooth with age, the insignia barely visible. But to him it was more than just a keepsake. It was a reminder of everything he had lived through, everything he had sacrificed. Without warning, Damien's hand shot out. "Let's see it, Rambo," he said, reaching for the coin that was peeking out from Bobby's jacket. Bobby's hand twitched in response, but he didn't stop the young man. Not at first. Damien flipped the coin over in his fingers, his laughter fading as he studied the engraving. "What's this?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "What's with this symbol?" He turned the coin over, examining the intricate design. Bobby stepped forward, calm but firm. "Give it back," he said, extending his hand. "Please." Damien took a step back, grinning. "Oh, now it matters," he teased. "What's this, your lucky penny soldier boy?" The moment dragged on, heavy and tense. Bobby's voice remained steady, but his eyes hardened. "You should be careful when pretending with ghosts," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but something inside him had shifted. This wasn't just about a coin. It was about respect. It was about history. Damien scoffed, unamused by the old man's words. "Wow, deep," he muttered. But before he could continue, Bobby's hand shot out again. This time he didn't ask. His fingers brushed against Damien's, not to grab the coin, but to reclaim it with a quiet intensity. It happened in an instant. Damien yanked the coin away, and Bobby's calm composure fractured just slightly. He didn't reach for it aggressively. He didn't lash out. But his body language shifted, a subtle change in posture, like a predator pausing mid-pounce. And then it was too late. "Security!" Lexi screamed, her voice high with panic. "He's grabbing at us." Bobby's hand barely moved, but it didn't matter. The guard who had escorted him earlier appeared almost instantly, a taser raised. He didn't hesitate. The crack of electricity filled the air, and Bobby's body went rigid, his knees buckling under the force of the shock. He collapsed, the world spinning as the taser's jolt tore through him. The coin slipped from his hand, clinking against the cold, sterile floor. It spun once, twice, before it came to rest near Camilla's feet. Bobby's body remained slumped on the ground, his breath shallow but still steady. He reached instinctively for something that wasn't there, his rifle, his comrades, a memory he couldn't shake. But his fingers grazed the floor, the metal cold against his skin, and the coin lay still by Camilla's feet. She looked down, her eyes widening as she took in the engraved symbol. It was familiar to her, but she couldn't place it. Not until she saw the words, 3 simple letters, beneath the raven emblem. SIA. Her heart stopped. Special Intelligence Alpha. This wasn't just some old man. This was Robert Slater, a name from a Black Ops program, a ghost from history. And suddenly, everything changed. She stood, her fingers tightening around the coin as the room went silent. The crowd had started to gather, phones raised, but Camilla wasn't watching them. She wasn't watching the developers either. Her gaze was fixed on Bobby, now lying on the floor, a symbol of something far greater than they had ever understood. And then she spoke, her voice clear and cutting through the confusion. "Do you even know who he is?" she asked, her words carrying across the now still room. Bobby lay on the cold floor of the expo hall, the sharp sting of the taser still radiating through his body. His muscles burned and his chest heaved with every shallow breath. His mind was slow to catch up with his body, but there was something deeper inside him, something he couldn't ignore no matter how many times he'd been knocked down before. The sharp hum of fluorescent lights above and the sterile air of the expo hall filled the space around him. For a moment, everything felt distant, like he was hearing the world through a thick fog. His hand twitched instinctively, reaching for something that wasn't there. A weapon, a hand of a comrade, anything but his fingers, brushed the cold floor. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, but Bobby didn't move. He could hear voices now, murmurs of confusion, anger, and a few whispers of what just happened. Above him, a young woman crouched down. It was Camilla, the journalist, who had watched the entire exchange unfold. Her camera phone was in her hand, but it was no longer recording the moment. Instead, she held the coin Bobby had dropped. She turned it over slowly, her fingers brushing against the engraved symbol. Omega Raven. For a moment, she stared at the coin in silence, her brow furrowing as she recognized the significance of what she was holding. She had seen it before, tucked deep within classified military reports during her thesis research. The Omega Raven was a symbol from the shadows of military history, SIA Special Intelligence Alpha, a ghost program long buried. Bobby wasn't just a veteran. He was part of something far more dangerous and covert, something far older than the glossy, tech-obsessed world around them. She looked down at Bobby, who was still on the floor, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. His eyes were unfocused, but the fire within them hadn't died. He was still there despite the taser's assault, still breathing, still waiting. A voice cut through the tension. "Get medical for Sergeant Slater now." Major General Ellis Cray, who had appeared from the crowd, commanded in a voice so full of authority that even the surrounding security guard hesitated for a moment. The guards, however, didn't respond quickly enough. They remained rooted in place, uncertain. Their hesitation was met with a silence that was palpable, the kind that held 1,000 unspoken words. Bobby's gaze shifted slowly up to the man now kneeling beside him. It was Cray, someone Bobby had recognized immediately. The general's face softened as he looked down at the wounded soldier. "You okay, old man?" Cray's voice was quiet, almost private, as he placed a hand on Bobby's shoulder. His voice was steady, like a familiar refrain from the past. Bobby blinked slowly, the recognition coming in flashes. "Ellis? Cray? Najaf? The operation? I told you to shut up and bleed quieter." Bobby rasped, a thin smile pulling at the corner of his lips despite the pain. Cray's chuckle was soft, a brief moment of humanity in the midst of chaos. "Always the smartass." Cray muttered, his hand pressing firmly against Bobby's shoulder to steady him. "Let's get you up." The crowd around them had grown. Phones were raised, video feeds streaming live across social media. The tech world, which had once dismissed Bobby as irrelevant, now turned its eyes toward him, searching for answers. The incident, the tasering of an old man, was too much for the crowd to ignore. It was something raw, too real to be ignored in this realm of slick simulations and artificial life. Camilla stepped back, her fingers still clutching the coin. She hadn't known. No one had. She had been filming, ready to write the story of a poor, confused old man, until she saw the insignia on the coin. Until she realized that Bobby Slater was more than just a soldier. He was the reason these simulations even existed in the first place. In the midst of the confusion, she spoke up, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Do you even know who he is?" The question hung in the air, and everyone who had been laughing, mocking, or indifferent to Bobby's presence fell silent. Camilla's words carried the weight of something much bigger than they had realized. This was no ordinary old man. This was Sergeant Robert Slater, a legend that should never have been forgotten. The developers, Damien, Lexi, and Trevor, still stood at the edge of the crowd, their smirks faltering. Lexi was the first to glance away, her eyes finally showing the signs of discomfort. Damien, who had been so eager to mock Bobby, looked around uncomfortably. Trevor, still holding his phone, looked down at his screen, his fingers now shaking as they scrolled through news alerts. And then the man who had remained silent until now, Major General Ellis Cray, spoke again, this time with purpose. "Sergeant Slater," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "You're about to learn something about who you've been mocking, who you've been treating like a glitch in your system." Cray stood tall, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing. "This man carried me out of Najaf when I couldn't walk. I owe him my life. The world owes him the recognition he's been denied." Bobby, still on the floor, didn't move. His eyes were distant, but something in Cray's words stirred something deep within him. The memories of men he'd carried through war, the faces of friends lost, flooded back. He had never asked for recognition, never sought out the fame that the world was now trying to impose on him. But for once, it felt like the world was finally catching up to something real. The crowd that had once been indifferent now began to murmur. They shifted uneasily, realizing that their mockery had been misplaced, that they had crossed a line they had no right to. The scene was unfolding, but not in the way the developers had expected. They had wanted the simulation to stay clean, to remain neat and orderly, a controlled demonstration of a future where reality could be manufactured. But Bobby had shattered that illusion, and now the world was starting to see the cost of pretending that war was just a game. As Cray knelt beside Bobby, the rest of the expo hall remained eerily silent. The only sound was the distant hum of machinery, a reminder that this was a place built on the promise of progress. But progress, Bobby knew, had its price, and today the cost was clear. "We can't undo what's been done," Cray said softly, his voice low as he helped Bobby sit up. "But we can begin to make it right." And with that, the world around them began to change. The story of Sergeant Robert Slater, once forgotten, was now being written in the most unexpected place. The crowd had gathered in silence, the once lively hum of the expo now eerily quiet. It was as if the very air had thickened, stilled, waiting for the weight of a moment to settle. Major General Ellis Cray stood before them, his uniform crisp, his posture unwavering. Behind him, a few military police stood at attention, their presence commanding, but not oppressive. The expanse of the expo hall, typically filled with flashing screens and virtual displays, felt suddenly empty, as if the world had briefly paused to witness something far more significant than the technology surrounding them. Bobby Slater sat in a wheelchair near the front, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his posture dignified despite the bruises and exhaustion. He wasn't wearing medals or a uniform. There were no embellishments to his character now. There was only the simple, steady presence of a man who had lived through things the world preferred to forget. The room had fallen silent for the first time in the event's history. No applause, no flashing lights. The stage was bare except for the podium and Cray's presence. The lights had been dimmed not for effect but for gravity. For once, there was no pre-programmed show, no digital banners advertising the latest advancements. All eyes were on Bobby. Cray stepped forward, his voice low but resolute, carrying through the stillness of the room. "We created this event to showcase the future." He began, his gaze sweeping over the audience, including the developers who had mocked Bobby only hours ago. But in doing so, we forgot the cost of what came before. He paused for a long moment, letting the words sink in. "You all witnessed something today," Cray continued, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet fury. "A decorated veteran, a man who has seen more than any of us could imagine, was tasered not for being violent, not for trespassing, but for being inconveniently human." The room shifted uncomfortably. The developers in the front row, now stripped of their bravado, fidgeted in their seats. Trevor avoided eye contact, his lips tight. Damien looked at the floor, his defiance gone, replaced with a new sense of discomfort. Lexi, too, had her head down, her hands clutching the armrests of her seat. The reality of what had transpired was settling in, and the veneer of confidence had cracked. Cray's gaze hardened as he turned to face the developers. "You treated Sergeant Slater like code that didn't compile," he said, his voice rising slightly. "But he isn't broken. He isn't outdated. He is the reason your simulation exists at all." He stepped forward closer to Bobby, who remained still, his expression calm but implacable. With a quiet reverence, Cray reached out and lifted the coin that Bobby had dropped earlier from Kamala's hand. It glinted in the light, the Omega Raven insignia, reflecting the dim stage lights. "I owe my life to him," Cray said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "You owe him your silence, your apology." The room seemed to hold its breath as Cray walked slowly to Bobby's side. He stood beside him for a moment, looking down at the man who had carried him through war, through horrors that no simulation could ever replicate. Then, with a gesture of respect, Cray carefully affixed a small rectangular bronze plaque to the base of the VR pod where the simulation had been housed. The plaque was simple yet powerful. The engraving read, "Robert Slater. He carried the reality we couldn't simulate." The words hung in the air, as permanent as the silence that followed them. The room, once filled with the buzz of high-tech innovation, now stood in quiet reflection. Bobby, who had said little since Cray's arrival, looked at the plaque for a long moment before speaking. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet sadness to it, as if a weight had been lifted just a little. "I never wanted this," he said softly. "I didn't ask for anyone to remember me. I just wanted the world to understand. That war isn't clean. It isn't a game you win by following a checklist. It's something else. Something harder." He looked up, his eyes meeting the room of strangers who had once mocked him. "You can't simulate that." Kamala, who had been standing off to the side watching this quiet transformation, took a step forward. She had been filming the entire time, but now the phone in her hand felt like a distant tool, something unnecessary. Instead, she held the velvet box she had brought with her, a symbol of recognition, not for Bobby's past, but for the world's new understanding of what it owed him. With a solemn gesture, she walked to the stage and handed the box to Cray. The room watched in stunned silence, as the general opened it, revealing the small, simple plaque inside. The room seemed to breathe collectively as Cray affixed the plaque to the base of the VR booth. This was not a ceremony of honor, not yet, but it was a start. Cray turned back to the crowd, his voice firm. You want to design the future? Then start by remembering who bled for the present. Respect isn't retro. Dignity isn't legacy code. He paused for a moment before raising his hand in a formal salute. The room froze for a brief heartbeat before something extraordinary happened. One by one, the people in the audience began to rise. The developers, Damien, Lexi, Trevor, hesitated, but slowly, almost reluctantly, they stood. Some saluted sharp and military, while others simply placed their hands over their hearts in a gesture of quiet respect. It wasn't commanded. It wasn't forced. It was a response raw and unfiltered. Bobby didn't smile. He simply nodded. It was a nod of recognition, not for himself, but for the men and women who had fought beside him, the ones who would never return, the ones whose faces he could still see in his mind when he closed his eyes, the ones whose sacrifices had never been acknowledged. For the first time in decades, someone remembered. From the second row, a woman, a former RAF engineer, raised her hand in a slow, deliberate salute. A man in a dark suit, one of the translators for the Japanese delegation, followed suit. Then a teenager, a participant of the Expo's accessibility tech panel, rose and saluted, his prosthetic leg clicking softly against the floor. The slow ripple of salutes continued throughout the room, each one imperfect, some unpracticed, but all genuine. It wasn't for Bobby. It was for the countless others who had fought, bled, and died in wars that no one cared to remember. As the final salute was given, Bobby's gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in the faces of those who had once dismissed him, now acknowledging him. For a brief moment, the world of technology, of simulations and virtual futures, had made space for something real. And for Bobby Slater, that was enough. After the last salute, Cray stood tall, looking out over the room with quiet pride. Now, he said, his voice steady, we remember. And with that, the crowd began to disperse, not in haste, but in reverence. The media flashes resumed, but this time they were documenting something different. Grace, not scandal. The world had shifted, even if just a little, and Bobby Slater, a man who had once been forgotten, was no longer invisible. As the expo hall emptied, Bobby sat quietly, his hands resting once more on the coin in his palm. It was heavier now, not because of the past it represented, but because he wasn't the only one carrying it anymore. The future would never be the same again.